He's a foreign correspondent over at Fox News. If you remember a couple episodes back, we spotlighted the tremendous work that some of the journalists have been doing out in the Ukraine. And this is one of them, Trey Yingst over at Fox News. Trey, Mike Leon, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Trey, I want to get into a bunch of different things with you and the kind of why you do what you do, because without people like you, we probably would have been getting the information that we need here in America. But first, I'd be remiss as a former Fox guy if you couldn't a little bit elaborate on your relationship with Pierre Zarshevsky, who recently passed away, and also the journalist from Ukraine, Sasha Kushyanova. I know your colleague Benjamin Hall was also injured. If you have any update on how he is doing, but at first, take us through a little bit of that traumatic experience and kind of when you found out where you were in the Ukraine when all of that happened, and then if you could a little bit on Pierre's life and legacy as a cameraman for the network.
Yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail about that day, but I'll just say that Pierre, Sasha, and Benjamin were out on the front lines trying to show the world what was happening on the ground in Ukraine. Some of the finest journalists that I've known in this profession. And Pierre is the best cameraman I've ever worked with. Benjamin, my colleague, who is currently healing and getting better, I know will be back to tell more stories because that is who he is. And I would just say that the work that we do as journalists on the front lines covering these conflicts around the world is extremely dangerous. And we take as many precautions as we can, but still bad things can happen. And certainly it was an honor to be able to work with Pierre, Sasha, and Benjamin on this story. And we will continue to tell stories around the world in their honor.
Yeah, I think people, to the outside observer don't really understand how that whole process works, how you guys get set up, lodging and everything, where you're going to be shooting from, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get into that in a little bit. If I can, let's get into the conflict at the current hand in the Ukraine. If you could give us the airplane view, the 30,000-foot view. You were in Kyiv, obviously. You saw firsthand what Russian soldiers were doing, what Ukrainian forces were doing to fight back. Can you give us a sense of your take at the 30,000-foot view level, the airplane view, I like to say, on the conflict overall?
So in the early days of this conflict, there was a real concern in the international community that the Russians would quickly take over major population centers across Ukraine. And it simply wasn't the case. We saw a fierce Ukrainian resistance, not only around the capital of Kyiv, but across the country as the Russians attacked different Ukrainian positions from the air and the ground. So you had weeks of battle around the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. And just in the past few days, Russian forces have pulled out in places like Irpin and Bucha, very close to the Ukrainian capital. And the devastation and destruction left behind is nothing short of horrific. Civilians who appear to have been executed in some areas, a large mass grave in the town of Bucha. This is a suburb of a European capital that was totally decimated by this conflict. Remember, the Ukrainians were defending and continue to defend their sovereign country. They did not ask for this war. They didn't want this war. And they're now left with a position that is quite difficult. They have to not only defend the cities that are currently being attacked by Russian forces, but also, according to officials we've talked to on the ground, work to take back cities that Russia currently occupies. So in the southern part, in Kherson, a region very close to the annexed part of Crimea that was taken by the Russians back in 2014, and also in the eastern Donbass region. So this war is nowhere close to over. The efforts for a peace settlement or some sort of ceasefire are currently stalled, it appears. And the reality on the ground is that while Russian forces have pulled back from Kyiv, they continue to advance in the eastern part of Ukraine. And so there are still millions of civilians at risk.
Trey, I want to get into a couple different things that you just said there. But first, I had, before the conflict started, award-winning journalist over at Foreign Policy, Amy McKinnon, on the program. And she was mentioning about Putin overall, that sometimes he's made out to be the US's boogeyman, but he's not 10 feet tall, but no one knows what he's thinking. So I'm going to ask you, what is he thinking? Do you think that Putin underestimated so far this invasion, the Ukrainian forces fighting back? What is your read and take from people on the ground, from people that you have talked to in the region?
It's impossible to get into the mind of Vladimir Putin, but we can understand, based on the movement of his troops and the actions that have been taken so far by his military, that the Russians did not expect this level of resistance. They didn't expect such a coordinated response by the Ukrainian military and government. And part of that is due to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the other part is due to the patriotic nature of the Ukrainian people, a population that is willing to put everything on the line to fight back for democracy, to fight back and secure their sovereignty. And it is a sentiment that we saw not only around the capital of Kyiv, but also in the weeks before the war, when we were reporting in the Donbass region, when we were reporting in the southern part of the country. You got this sense from the Ukrainian people that they knew a full-scale invasion was a possibility. It was largely considered a nightmare worst-case scenario, but they were in some part prepared for that reality. And it's part of the reason that we saw the Ukrainian people digging in, creating Molotov cocktails, digging trenches, and in the early days of this invasion, lining up at police stations in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv to get weapons and supplies so that they could properly fight back against this invasion. And that spirit and that effort to defend their country does continue today. It has shifted based on where the conflict is taking place and where the heaviest fighting is erupting, but it still does continue. And I think as this war enters a new phase, the international community can see just how brutal Vladimir Putin really is, and the playbook that he has used, not only on the ground in Ukraine, but as we've seen in other places in the world, like Syria, targeting civilian populations in an effort to move forces forward. They can get a real sense of what's happening in Ukraine and understand that when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is asking for weapons and support, he's asking for them for a very specific reason and with a specific urgency in mind. And that's what's happening right now in Ukraine.
Let's get into some of the support from Western nations, obviously at the onset of this conflict. And I keep calling it conflict because I do want to call it a war. I do want to call it an invasion. I want to keep with the words that everyone is kind of using. So for people that are listening, I know what's actually happening. We get it. It's a war and an invasion on the Ukraine. But in specific terms, in terms of some of the countries that have helped out so far in the Western nations, what more do you think the West, specifically the U.S., obviously in the NATO countries, can be doing? And at the onset, we saw all this early military support from a bunch of different nations, even Portugal as well, sending some support. What do you think in terms of all the support they've gotten so far and what more can be done?
Well, look, we hear a big concern from Ukrainian politicians and officials who say they appreciate the aid, but they want it to be coming into the country much more quickly. I think you will continue to hear that expression, sometimes a frustration from Ukrainian officials, because the war is on their doorstep. It's being fought in their cities as we speak. But there are a number of things the Ukrainians are asking for that they're not receiving from the international community. Some of the things are a no-fly zone, MiGs, different planes that could be used to push back against this Russian offensive, and then just more support in the form of anti-tank missiles, these air defense batteries that are used to shoot down Russian planes over Ukrainian cities. So in the coming weeks, those requests will stay firm, and they may even increase as Vladimir Putin pushes more resources into the eastern part of Ukraine. But there is a substantial amount of Western military equipment and support on the ground currently in Ukraine. And depending on who you ask, the specific requests will vary. But there are clear requests right now out for more air support, more tanks, which it does appear, according to reports in recent days, will be delivered to Ukraine. And then, of course, that humanitarian aid that is critical for the millions of Ukrainians who fled the country, but also the millions of Ukrainians who are internally displaced, who still have left their homes as the conflict expanded and entered different parts of this country. And they are also facing dire situations on the ground, because it's not just leaving your country that can be detrimental to the health and well-being of the Ukrainian people. Having to leave your home and go to a different city where you don't have the resources and the foundation and the support can be quite difficult.
Trey, we spotlighted a few episodes back something that you said on air about Russia considering disinformation, at least by their terms, and what it's punishable by in terms of like 15 years in prison for journalists that were spreading, according to them and according to the Kremlin, misinformation. We had one of your colleagues, Fox News contributor Marie Harf, that worked at the State Department on, and we were talking about some of these numbers that are so gargantuan in terms of Russian military troop loss. I mean, if you told the American people that 16,000 US troops died over a 4-week span, I think there'd be a lot of protests out in the street. I don't want to generalize, but that is a large swath of people. The amount of civilians that have been killed, according to UN reports, are in the 1,500, closer to 2,000 civilians that have been killed in this conflict. What do you make of all the misinformation and disinformation that we're kind of seeing trickle out, specifically from the Russian side, maybe some numbers from the Ukrainian side that can't be verified? What do you make of all of this misinformation, disinformation out there?
Look, there's a massive information war going on in parallel to this conflict that's taking place on the ground in Ukraine right now, and a concerted effort by the Russian government to disseminate disinformation so that people, at least inside Russia, don't actually understand what's happening. And there will be a number of people who look at what's happening and gauge how successful this disinformation campaign by the Russians actually is. But the reality is, we know the Russians say things like they are not targeting civilian areas when our cameras and our interviews are evidence that they are indeed targeting civilian areas. They claim that they did not take part in the killing of civilians in Bucha, some of the images that we're seeing today. But all information on the ground from independent journalists and reports indicates it was the Russians who conducted these killings. So that's our role as journalists, to hold public officials, to hold governments accountable for the words that they say and the actions that they take on the ground. Very often around the world, the Russians will claim they are entering into ceasefire negotiations while they continue to bombard cities. It's a very classic Russian playbook to do this. It's very disturbing to see the images out of Bucha, this suburb of Kyiv. And it really gets to the core of what's taking place and who is paying the highest price on the ground in Ukraine. And that is the civilian population. The Russians started this war with disinformation, a very coordinated act of disinformation. They looked at the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in the eastern part of Ukraine, some of these separatist controlled areas. And it was very clear they were trying to put the blame on the Ukrainians. Well, we had just been to the Eastern Front. We were in the trenches talking with Ukrainian soldiers as these Russian-backed separatists targeted their positions. And you could see where the fire was coming from. It wasn't coming from the Ukrainian side. It was coming from the Russian-backed areas. And that is exactly where this war started. But very quickly, in the early hours of this conflict, the Russians targeted cities across Ukraine. It was not just focused on the east. And in the coming days and weeks, it will be critical to get to the core of what happened here, to verify information, to appropriately provide supporting evidence to what happened, and to ensure that amid the fog of war, international journalists are able to gather evidence and facts and make sure the world knows what happened and what continues to happen on the ground in Ukraine.
Trey, the title of this episode is called The Danger Zone with Trey Yingst, a play on the Top Gun theme song. I want you to kick back for a second for me, my friend, because I want to get into the psyche of you. I want to know why you run to danger when people tend to run away from it, and you run there with a microphone and camera. You've had access to the Taliban. You have covered this conflict in Ukraine. You've been other places across the media spectrum. What is it about these type of scenarios, war situations like this, that makes Trey Yingst grab his mic and take a cameraman with him and say, I'm going to go cover this?
I love this job. It is part of my identity. It's something that consumes me each and every day because I feel a massive responsibility to show the world what's happening in some of the most dangerous locations. We've reported in places like Gaza, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon. And there's this common thread of trying to find light in very dark places. I struggle, but focus on the question of how do I make people care? Because it can often seem like a movie to people thousands of miles away. These atrocities that are being committed against the civilian population, it can be very hard for the brain to consume and understand. And that's part of my job as a journalist in conflict zones, to go to these places and make people care, to provide as many facts and pieces of evidence as I can, and to put these stories in a way that are consumable, but also relatable. It's part of the reason that we talk about mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and athletes and musicians, because I think that our viewers can grasp the Ukrainian people right now who are under fire, who are watching their cities burn to the ground, are just like you and I. They feel emotion, they feel fear, they feel happiness, they feel love. And I personally feel a massive responsibility to tell those stories. And I feel very grateful to have an organization like Fox behind me that allows me to do that. The ability to go to a war zone is not something that can just easily be done. There's a lot of coordination that goes on behind the scenes. There are efforts from executives and from producers and from crews all around the world that come together in order to make that final product that you see on air. And it would not be possible without the team that I have. It would not be possible without the support that I have from this company. And the reality is there is a focus on making sure the world knows what's happening, not only in Ukraine, but around the world when conflict erupts. And I just feel grateful to have the opportunity to be the guy who gets to go there and tell those stories.
You know, Trey, you did a recent interview with Forbes. I want to kind of stay on the mother, brothers, children aspect of this, because as a father of two little girls, you spoke about how children are trying to remain children during this crisis, right? And some of the other invasions that you've covered as well. How are the parents that you've either talked to about this, how are you seeing them manage to create a form of reality where their kids can still be childlike in the most difficult of times?
I think that's the hardest thing for parents in war zones. I think of the individuals that we interviewed. Sometimes it was a mother and father at a train station as the family had to say goodbye to every military age male who would have to stay behind and fight. I think of a woman named Evgenia Antonenko who was fleeing the town of Irpin right next to Bucha. We spoke to her on a bridge as Russian artillery rounds were landing on either side. And she described a nightmare scenario as she tried to shield the eyes of her young daughter from bodies in the streets of their hometown. And when you look into the eyes of these parents, you understand that they feel such frustration and helplessness because as a parent, you want to protect your children. It's a very basic human desire. And so many of the parents that we meet in war zones around the world, specifically Ukraine, have done everything they can to protect their children from the destruction and danger around them. And still, it's not enough. And I think that can be very hard to process, but it can also be an opportunity to tell a story. Because when we're able to speak to Evgenia and tell the story of her family on oftentimes the worst day of someone's life, I think we can tell that journey and explain that journey in a way that makes people really grasp just how horrific the scenario is and really helps people to relate to the civilians who are most affected.
Trey, before we let you go, something I've asked of a few different people that have come on from different outlets or have different background in government about this is the prognostication part of this, right? Putting your prognosticator's hat on, which is probably a better equipped hat than most people who haven't been to the region or seen this conflict up close and personal. What is your take on where this ends? I think as Americans, I could speak for myself in terms of actualities. We look for finality in something, and I don't know where I see finality in this, whether it's, peace talks, whether it's Ukraine being a smaller version of what it was before, whether it's Ukraine pushing Russian forces all the way back. I don't think that will happen. But what is your read on a month from now, 2 months from now, a year from now, what this conflict ended up in?
I think it's too soon to tell where this leads 2 or 3 months from now. The reality is that Ukrainian forces are not going to let Russian troops occupy their cities. And we talked about this a little earlier on, but the Ukrainians have been quite successful in taking back territory from Russian forces. They have put up a fierce resistance. And so while weapons continue to flow into this country, the Ukrainians are plotting to take back land that's currently controlled by Russian forces. So this is not a scenario where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will simply sit back and say, you may have it, to the Russians, to Russian President Putin. It's much different on the ground. The Ukrainians still have a fighting spirit. They still have support from the international community, and they still have a population that is prepared to enter new battles and new fronts against the Russian invaders in their country. And I think that is significant because while you've seen the Russian forces pull back from the area around Kyiv, there are places in the south. We talk about that city, Mariupol, the port city. We talk about the Kherson region. We talk about Luhansk and Donetsk that are partially controlled by Russian forces. If the Ukrainians are able to hold territory that belongs to them, and there is a level of stability that allows them to move forces further east, we can expect Ukraine to fight back against the Russians and try to take territory. So what you may see over the next several months is a front line that's constantly changing. In the eastern part of Ukraine, there has been a war over the past 7 to 8 years where a front line just stood still, and it moved slightly week to week, month to month, but there was a concerted effort by the Ukrainians to hold a solid front line. And so what we're looking at today is a war that is in some areas expanding, is still very active, and shows no end in sight. And so there will be peace talks. There will be efforts to get a humanitarian ceasefire in place to allow more civilians to get out of harm's way. But the Ukrainian military will continue to fight for the sovereignty of their country. And Russian President Putin will likely not leave without a territorial victory that allows him to save face at home. So I think we are looking at much more conflict, unfortunately, in the days, weeks, and months to come. And at the same time, we can only hope that humanitarian law is respected and that the civilian population is able to get out of the way. Because as we have seen in the images today and throughout this conflict, the civilian population of Ukraine pays the highest price amid this war. And while there may not be a political settlement in the short term, the civilian population will have to survive amid this conflict.
Trey Yingst, as a former PA writer over there at the network, I always tell people about the good work that the news division house at Fox does. You are a product of that, my friend. I wish you continued success and stay safe wherever you are traveling to. Check out Trey Yingst across Fox's shows. He's a foreign correspondent. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today, Trey. I truly appreciate it.
Mike, thank you.